reducing their 1,000-year-old tropical civilization to dust and ashes. Few were as brutal as the Belgians, but across the continent, millions of Africans were compelled to abandon a way of life perfectly adapted to the tropics, and to labor for Europeans. To ferry Africa's natural wealth back to Europe, the colonizers turned again to their technology, building ever greater railroads. After more than half a century and the labor of tens of thousands, tracks of shining steel reached all the way from the Cape into the very heart of the tropics. Constructed for Europeans to extract Africa's wealth. Built on the ruins of African civilization.
All this time, I've been uncovering the trail of guns, germs, and steel across Africa. And even this train and the track it rides on lie at the heart of my story. These tracks are still in use, still fulfilling their original purpose. Trains travel from the southern tip of Africa into modern Congo and Zambia, ferrying back tons of copper and other minerals. But Africa today is no longer a continent of colonies. Its nations are free and independent. What place is there for my theory of guns, germs, and steel in modern Africa?
Ndola, northern Zambia, the end of the line for Jared Diamond. Civil war in the neighboring Congo makes it too dangerous to travel the last few miles of this track. But even here, the reality of modern Africa is clear.
I'm now in the center of the African tropics, and I'm in Zambia, one of the poorest countries in Africa and really in the whole world. The average annual income here is a few $100s, and the average lifespan of a Zambian is 35 years, so I myself have now lived nearly 2 average Zambian lifetimes. What goes through my mind here is, what can history and geography and guns, germs, and steel tell us that would help us understand the plight of Zambia today? In modern Zambia, I see few signs around me of the great native civilizations that once flourished in tropical Africa. What I see instead is a country shaped by colonization. I see towns and cities that grew up next to the mines and railroads established by Europeans and built on the European model. What about the great forces that originally shaped this continent and its people? The forces behind its conquest by Europeans. Where are guns, germs, and steel in modern Africa?
In Zambia, malaria is endemic. It is the #1 public health problem. And when you look at the children particularly, when you go to a health facility, up to 45% of the children in the outpatient facility of the hospital will actually be presenting with malaria.
Germs, one of Diamond's great forces of history, are still shaping the story of modern Zambia. Not just the recent scourge of AIDS, but also that ancient tropical disease that defeated Europeans, malaria. Malaria is now the #1 killer of African children under 5 years old.
This old register will just show you the picture of the number of deaths that could have occurred within the hospital. Most of them are children below 5 years.
Yeah.
1 year, 6 months, 3 years, 5 months, 1 year. Most of them are really below 5 years.
Tropical Africans once lived in settlements spread out over large areas, which minimized the spread of malaria. But now they're living in modern, high-density cities and towns, and the rate of infection has increased dramatically. The burden of germs is one of the greatest problems afflicting the country.
Undoubtedly, malaria has a very big economic burden on us as a country. Because as you may be aware, if so many children would be suffering from malaria, if we just look at the children who are in this ward, these mothers would be working somewhere and being productive. Yeah. So that's one direct way in which we know productivity is being affected to a large extent.
It's been estimated by eminent economists that the 1% negative growth each year in Africa over the last half a century can be attributed entirely to malaria.
The immunities and antibodies that Africans had developed over thousands of years to protect them from malaria no longer provide sufficient protection. The strains of the disease are mutating, and standard drugs are becoming less effective. In the high malaria season, up to 7 children a day die in this hospital.
You're used to this. I'm not. What does the scene make you feel about your work in Zambia?
Exactly. To be frank with you, Gerard, I wouldn't say I'm used to this, because I don't think there's anyone who can be used to sickness and eventually death, especially of people that you love so very much and are a part of you. It is something that, in fact, I would say, because of the magnitude of the problem, one would wish to do everything they possibly could do. Because of the fact that
there's a difference between understanding something intellectually and experiencing it firsthand. In my book, Germs was one of the 3 main forces of history, and it's impersonal. And it's still different, and it hits me to be in a place where germs are in action. "30 years ago, I set out on a journey. A quest to understand the origins of inequality in our world. I discovered that this story stretched back to the beginning of civilization and rested on the geography of our planet. When humans first started farming, one small area in the world was lucky enough to have the best crops and animals, which gave one group of people a unique advantage in history. Europeans perfected guns and steel, evolved lethal diseases and germs. They then used these tools to conquer continents and to build extraordinary wealth. I conclude that geography and guns, germs, and steel have been the strongest forces to shape the history of our world. Here in Zambia, these forces are still shaping the world today. Tropical germs are overwhelming this country and its people and driving them into poverty. Does that mean that Zambia will always remain a victim of these great forces of history and